Okay.
Welcome to DS7. Danny and Manny, or Danielle and Manny. Sorry.
Not Danny and Manny. I'm Manisha, this is Danielle, and we're DS7, and this year we're going to be looking at haunted landscapes. Just to give you an idea of the territory we began investigating last year, it's something that we call the continuous present, which is a title we borrowed from Gertrude Stein. And what we mean by that is basically at a time when most of architecture is interested in a historical past or a dystopian future, we're really interested in the contemporary or the now, and the role of the architect in the kind of contemporary architectural landscape. And so last year we interrogated this through the museum. And the reason we were interested in this is because we believe that architecture shouldn't be just about tabula rasa conditions where you erase everything and build anew. And it shouldn't be about pristinely preserving everything as well, but rather it should be somewhere between that, where the architect is kind of updating buildings that exist already and keep allowing them to exist more fully in the present. And so this is a slide from a Rem Koolhaas lecture at Columbia, where he shows how the distance between what we preserve and the present is constantly decreasing, so that we'll soon be in a time where preservation actually becomes something proactive that we do while designing the building rather than retroactive. So last year we explored this through the typology of the museum, where we challenged students to question the museum as something that traditionally collects the past and invited them to reinvent forms of the museum that collected the present. And this year we're trying to move away from, we went to New York last year, so we were looking at the hyper-urban condition, and this year we're moving to a more kind of landscape territory.
Yeah, and this year we're going to continue these ideas through the concept of haunting, and we should say now that when we say haunting, we don't mean horror. They're very different things, and we'll develop that. So architecture is haunted. You might imagine this as a haunting. There's an interior, it might be Victorian most likely. There are some presences that perhaps you can see, you can't see. But we're interested in other ways that architecture is haunted, how ghosts of former occurrences and agents, history, environments, obsolescences, shifts in social, technological aspects can linger and construct a building. So some examples here that help us kind of talk about this idea of haunting as a manifesting of what lingers in architecture. This is Bungalow Germania, which was the 2014 German pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And here the architecture of the German Chancellor's bungalow at Bonn was introduced to the pavilion architecture. So one building haunts another, the different representations of the German state come together and haunt one another. This is a project by Jorge Otero Palos, who's an experimental preservationist. And here he has used a method of cleaning, usually used in conservation, to remove dirt and pollution from a building. But instead of just cleaning that away, he's preserved the cast of the dirt, suggesting that maybe the things that we erase, such as pollution, are actually the accurate indexes of our time. And 6A Architects, this is related to the Raven Row Gallery project, which is a pair of 18th century houses that are thick with history that wasn't necessarily present, yet was hidden within the archives, where they discovered the story of this fire that gutted the buildings. And this fire, the story of this fire now lingers and haunts the building in the charred timber that they've used throughout. And Alison and Peter Smithson's Robin Hood Gardens, where the undulating landscape was constructed from the bomb rubble and debris of the East End in the site where the project was built. So throughout the year we'll share examples of haunting in literature, in film, in art. This is a film by artist John Smith called The Black Tower, where the protagonist is actually haunted by architecture that becomes mobile in the landscape, and it's a sinister presence that follows him. Our site will be Dungeness. Dungeness is a headland on the south coast of England. It grew as an unplanned settlement, a kind of non-planned settlement among the community of fishermen. And it's a conservation area. It's very sensitive to development. And in working there, we want to develop an understanding of what it means to build in a landscape that is at once defined by its impermanence, the kind of impermanent, transient nature of the architecture, of also the shingle terrain. So it's defined by its impermanence, and yet is acutely sensitive to change in its conservation area appraisal and listing. So in contrast to the transient architecture of Dungeness, there are 2 nuclear power stations, one of which we'll have a tour of when we visit there. The lighthouses that speak of the seafaring history and the kind of treacherous seas beyond the headland, and then sitting somewhere in between the transient and the permanent. Here is a ghost of a church steeple from a church that was formerly on the site and then demolished. We'll encounter the proto-radar devices built to detect sounds that otherwise one could not hear, and find that Dungeness has been a home to artists, most notably the filmmaker Derek Jarman, who uses Dungeness a lot in his films and will be a kind of rich source of reference for us. So Dungeness is a place of movement, change, myth and rumour. It's said that the shingle may just disappear into the sea within 2 lifetimes. It's haunted by stories of shipwrecks, what might be under the seas, also the statement that it is Britain's only desert, whether that's true or not, what the classifications are of that, all to be explored.
It was strange, you know, like that.
Can anyone hear this?
It's windy.
Yeah.
I didn't expect much, but I expected a village. Do you see what I mean? With a pub, perhaps wine shop. Because this isn't a village, when you step off the train, this is it. I like it because I like wild places. And we couldn't get anything wilder than this, could you?
It's just a mood video, so it's not that important to sound.
So just quickly, the trip costs. This is just a 1-night visit, and that's £210, including travel and accommodation, because train travel in England is quite expensive.
So just as Danielle explained haunting earlier, I'm going to just go a bit more into the kind of landscape part of the title and to talk about how landscape can be an architectural project. So what we mean by landscape in the studio is looking specifically at Dungeness. Can be a material landscape, so in this case looking at the shingle and the patterns through which it's laid onto the site. Looking at shipwrecks, mapping them out on the coast of Dungeness. This is not a map of Dungeness, but it's looking at the idea of how historical events have shaped the present condition of the site. So what the positioning of the lighthouses and the kind of debris that's scattered on the beach. It can also be a field of forces. This is like a field condition model of the Arctic landscape by a lateral office, and the model was called the active layer. And it can also be the reverse engineering of an event that happened. This is a project by Forensic Architecture, where they scanned the landscape and then tried to use that to understand the kind of atrocities relating to the abuse of human rights in some of the living death camps in Yugoslavia. So they do a lot of work with 3D scanning to understand the landscape more. It can be a model. This is a model called Electric Aurora by Liam Young, and it's looking at kind of the invisible energy lines emitted by uranium, and it shows that's how something very small can have an impact across a much larger territory. And then this is a ghost basilica in Italy by Edoardo Tresoldi, and the use of wireframe here is really interesting because it's, as a material, it kind of shifts our understanding of space, and it blurs the boundaries between fiction and reality, solid and void, material and immaterial. Some just interesting textures of that project.
So there are a number of ways that we'll begin to engage with the site. We'll begin by playing a game of architectural exquisite corpse. Exquisite corpse is a game of unplanned composition that was invented by the Surrealists, and we will adapt this to the fragments of Dungeness that we collect to talk about the kind of ever accumulating unplanned nature of the landscape in Dungeness. And even though we'll be playing our own architectural version of this, this is just from an AA student, Meridia, to kind of talk about the way the game works. And from that we'll start to develop drawings that look at the kind of the way things come together and accumulate and connect over time.
So moving from the exquisite corpse, we're going to employ 3D scanning within the unit. So this is an image made by ScanLab where they scanned a section of historic Rome and then overlaid on top of that the invisible things that you can't see from an aerial photograph. So there's all these underground tunnels and passageways. So it's mapping the unseen onto the scene. Moving from the city scale to the building scale, this is another scan by ScanLab that looks at the kind of ghostly figure of Abney Chapel amidst the forest that it's situated within. And so we'll be using, I think Brooks has a scanner that we're going to be using to generate point cloud scans of objects that we find on site on our visit to Dungeness. And then we're going to use a similar technique or technology to survey the site overall so that we're drawing a relationship across scales between objects and landscapes. We're also interested in trying to build this into the technology part of the studio, so we want to use different techniques. This is infrared film that was used by Moss to document the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and all the greens, because of the film, appear in this unique shade of pink, which is really fascinating because it causes you to read the landscape in a totally different way. I think, as Jaya mentioned in her presentation, we're going to be using photogrammetry, using multiple images to put together a kind of three-dimensional whole. And also other techniques, I think, like infrared thermography, electrometal ferromagnetic detection, and ultrasonics, which are all ways to visualize the unseen or the subterranean in addition to the seen as part of our surveys. A big part of the studio is to develop our own language or notation for drawing, and we'll take inspiration from drawings like this one by architect Perry Culper that has embedded within it its own notation and its own narratives. We'll also look at the work of artist Emma McNally, that here she draws like a kind of sound field, and she's exploring the difference between noise and signal. And we'll also look at more traditional survey drawings. This was done by architecture student Christopher Penrich, and it looks at how landscape, architectural built form, and kind of more inhabitable details are given